Away from the battlefields and home in Britain, the history of the Great War surrounds us. At Shorncliffe in Kent, we explore one of more than 12,000 grave locations located across the United Kingdom. What can it tell us about the wider history of the First World War? I often say that the Great War is all around us, and it is, on the war memorials in our local villages and towns and cities, in the churches and in the local small cemeteries, the churchyards close to where we live, and across Britain in the houses where the soldiers who marched the war lived themselves. Somehow the Great War is ever present if we search for it, if we care to look. And right across Britain, something that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission have been looking to highlight in recent years, there are over 12,000 grave locations from both world wars. Sometimes a single grave in a churchyard through to bigger collections of burials. And since my relocation back down to Kent, I thought it was about time that I came out and reconnected with some of these Great War locations which are now on my doorstep. And here I am today, sitting in a quiet corner of Kent, in between the town of Hythe and the town of Folkestone. The sea is just across to my left. I can see it through the trees, the English Channel, and a few short miles across that channel is the French coast, and 40 odd miles beyond there was the Western Front. And during the 4 years of the Great War, the civilian population were very aware of that because they could hear the rumble of bombardments across that channel like a distant thunder drifting towards them. But this was the power of the guns, the power of the artillery taking place in those battles along that Western Front, bombarding the front lines. And not just for the big battles as well. Sometimes the daily hate was pretty horrific, really, with the amount of shells that were just dropped on a regular basis. But in those big battles, like not so much the Somme, because that was further inland, but certainly in Flanders with Messines and Passchendaele in 1917, those battles were not that far from the Channel coast, and the rumblings of the millions of shells that were fired for those certainly could be heard in this part of Kent and are recorded in quite a lot of civilian diaries of the period. But where I'm sitting is one of these 12,000 grave locations, and this is not a single burial in a churchyard. This is a proper military cemetery. I'm at Shorncliffe Military Cemetery, and Shorncliffe barracks are very much part of the history of the British Army. British regiments were based here back to and beyond the Napoleonic period, for example. And at the time of the Great War, there was a substantial amount of barracks here, where there were units of the regular army that were based here, who were then mobilised for war in August 1914. And then with the expansion of the army, with the formation of the new army, Kitchener's Army, following Lord Kitchener's call for volunteers, thousands of men joined the army, hundreds of thousands, 1 million by the end of 1914, and all these men joining these new units of the POWs battalions, and not just infantry regiments, but engineers, artillery, all sorts. They had to be housed somewhere, and a lot of the pre-existing barracks were used. Shorncliffe was a good example of that, and then new camps were established as well. On the way in today, we came past Sandling, and there was a camp there because it sat at the junction of a couple of railway systems, so you could bring troops in from other parts of the country and they could detrain at Sandling and march up to the camp that was up on the high ground beyond the village there. So there were new camps, there was existing barracks, and then Shorncliffe, as the war went on, took on a slightly different aspect in that it became a training centre, because it wasn't just British troops that were here. As the war moved on, men of many different nationalities passed through here, including the Canadians. This became one of the main Canadian depots during the Great War. Along the southern coast of Kent and Sussex, the Canadians had key depots where they held men when they were brought over from Canada in drafts, trained them up in those depots, in training centres, so they could be ready for the battlefields. And there was another big one at Seaford in Sussex, for example, and this big one here at Shorncliffe. And there's some really good photographs of the training centre here that the Canadians used. They dug trenches, there was a mine crater, different types of trenches, and they practiced attacks, they practiced raiding, and all of the kind of key skills that were then required. Sometimes it's easy to think the kind of soldiers of the Great War were just sent forward and made attacks where they just moved by routes, as the Americans say, across the battlefields, almost in kind of automaton fashion. But as the war went on, the level of training in the British and Empire forces grew and grew, and the proficiency of soldiers grew along with that. And this site is often described as the birthplace of modern warfare, because the Canadians were one of those that kind of pioneered that style of training, properly preparing men for the battlefield, making them understand what their role was, what their key core skills were, and then learning about other skills. So you taught men how to use the Lewis gun and how to use grenades, Mills bombs, rifle grenades, and other battlefield paraphernalia. So if in the midst of battle the man operating the Lewis gun or the trench mortar or the rifle grenade launcher gets hit, ordinary infantrymen know how to use it and they can take over and carry on. And as the war went on, new types of warfare were developed, and that was reflected in the training syllabuses that took place here. Now, this wasn't unique. Monash, General Monash, who commanded the 3rd Australian Division, did the same thing over on the Wiltshire, Hampshire kind of Downs area over there, and other locations within Britain did something similar. New Zealanders built the Messines model up at Cannock Chase, for example, showing that part of the battlefield. So this wasn't unique to the Canadians, but all part of a kind of bigger shift, I think, within what we can describe as the wider British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, of which the Canadians, the Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans and so on were all a part of. A change in approach to warfare that we see culminate in the battles of 1918, with the breakout on the Somme on the 8th of August 1918 and all the battles that followed. Really, that is the birth of modern warfare, where tanks and artillery and everything else come together. So this was a training area, and there are quite a lot of Canadian official photographs showing the training taking place here, and I'll put some of those onto the podcast website so you can see the types of trenches and that mine crater that they constructed. And in one of the shots there's a Martello Tower, which is one of the much earlier systems of defence that was built here, going back to when there was a threat of Napoleonic invasion. And that appears as kind of a landmark in the background of one of these photographs, and we just passed that on the way in here. And beneath it now, the slopes beneath it, is a modern housing estate, so that ground where the training centre was has been swallowed up by the modern world, and we're really very, very close to the coastline here. So those practice battles that were taking place here were literally inside of the Channel and pretty much almost inside of France. So when these men were being prepared for battle on the Western Front, they only kind of had to look to their left, and there was the reality in the far distance. Now, I've come here not to trace the signs of that training camp, but I've come here, as I say, to a burial ground. And in here, there are nearly 500 burials from the Great War. So this is not a small cemetery. It looks very much set in this kind of little hollow with a path. We've come down through a path with some older graves from pre-First World War periods, and then more modern period war graves with non-World War commemoration headstones. And here we spotted men from the 1970s who were killed in Northern Ireland, and then military servicemen who've died right up to the early part of this century. So this being a garrison, soldiers die of sickness, of illness, in accidents, and on operational service, and are brought back here for burial. So there's a reason why there's kind of more modern graves. And in here, in the First World War plot, which is the biggest part of it, sitting at the bottom of this hollow, I mean, it looks like a cemetery from the Great War on the Western Front, for example, but amongst it are far more individual, standard headstones. So there are crosses and tombstones and different designs of headstone amongst the Portland stone standard headstones that we're used to seeing in cemeteries of the Great War. And this is not uncommon in UK burial sites, where there was far more leeway for families to kind of put their own headstone on there. And some of these do date from the war itself, so they are original headstones that were put up by the comrades of these soldiers, and a decision was made to keep those. If they ever deteriorate, then the commission would replace them with a standard headstone. So we're looking at what looks like a typical military cemetery that we find in France and Flanders, but the vast majority of the men buried in here probably never saw combat, because these are men who have died in training and died in accidents or died of sickness. And another aspect of the burials in here is the fact that there were two main military cemeteries here in Shorncliffe Military Cemetery, and one at Sir John Moore Barracks up the road. And this was used largely by Canadians at one stage of the war, so there is quite a predominance of Canadian burials in here from the training centre and from Canadian soldiers being brought back from the battlefield. So even though the war was overseas, people still could die in Britain of training. And in the British Army, the ones who were buried here, they didn't qualify for any medals unless they'd served overseas. They did qualify for the memorial plaque, which we talked about in a previous podcast, and the memorial scroll, but not medals. The Canadians, though, were slightly different, because when they left Canada and came to Britain, they automatically qualified for the British War Medal, the silver medal that was issued after the war. So the Canadian casualties that are in here, of men who never got any further than Shorncliffe, they do have medals awarded to them. And the same would be to other overseas units like Australians and New Zealanders that are in here as well. And I'm not checked, I know there are Australians in here, but I'm not checked to see if there are any New Zealanders until I have a little kind of wander around. But there is quite a range of nationalities, and where I'm sitting here looking at the kind of overview of the cemetery, I've just looked to my left, and they're not standard war graves headstones. They look like kind of Victorian headstones, but I'm looking at the grave of 72367 Yang Chi-chun of the Chinese Labour Corps, and at the bottom of it says he died at Shorncliffe Hospital 30th of April 1918. So this is a plot of men from the Chinese Labour Corps with some very unusual headstones. And again, I'll put a picture of this onto the podcast website. Now, the reason they're here is that one of the other nationalities that established a depot here during the Great War was the Chinese Labour Corps. Recruited in China, over 100,000 Chinamen were recruited for the Chinese Labour Corps, brought across to Britain, and then assembled and sent to the Western Front to work as labour troops behind the line. And their depot was here from 1917 up until the last phase of when men from the Chinese Labour Corps were then demobilised and sent back to China. So these are men who have not died in combat or training as such, but they will have died of sickness and accidents, and some of the later ones from the kind of autumn of 1918 onwards would be people who had succumbed to Spanish flu, influenza, which was then sweeping Europe. So it's very much an international cemetery in many ways, this one, and it is one of those places where World War I meets World War II, not just because there are some Second World War burials in here, but I'm looking across now to a headstone where I can see bomb damage from the bombing in this area in World War II. So headstones that were put up in the Great War ended up in the path of accidental bombs. I mean, the Germans weren't bombing this cemetery, but bombs fell and shrapnel hit the headstones, and there's some damage to it. And one in particular I'm looking at that's very visible. And again, I'll put a picture of that onto the podcast website. But there's some very interesting stories in here. And what I'm going to do, I haven't done a lot of research on the graves at this point. And sometimes when I come to a cemetery for the first time, one of the things I like to do is to kind of read that cemetery, kind of walk around it and look for patterns, look for dates, and see what we can kind of find there. And that's what I'm going to do next, is get up and have a wander around the cemetery and see what kind of stories that we can find here at Shorncliffe Military Cemetery. So I'm walking now down into the main plot of the cemetery, and this little section that I've just come into is from the very end of the Great War. I'm looking at November 1918 burials and on into the early part of 1919, and a good kind of spread of different regiments. At this stage, I suspect there was no exact kind of pattern to the casualties that were being brought into the hospitals here. I suspect we'll see a more kind of regular pattern to the burials as we move into the main cemetery itself. So I've walked down into one of the main plots now, and I'm very much in a Canadian plot here. There's rows and rows of headstones with the Canadian maple leaf on it, and I can see units that I know did not serve overseas. 101st Battalion Canadian Infantry, Private Bright, who died on the 8th of January 1917. So that was a unit formed in Canada, part of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, then sent as a draft to Britain to replace losses on the Western Front in other battalions. But buried next to him is Private Savitard of the 8th Canadian Infantry Battalion, and he died on the 26th, 27th of April 1917. So he would have been wounded in the action around Vimy and on the Douai Plain, beneath it perhaps. His battalion, part of the 1st Canadian Division, went over the top on the southern sector of the Vimy front on the 9th of April 1917, just a few weeks before he was killed, and he may well have been wounded in those operations, evacuated, station, casualty clearing station, base hospital, and then brought across the channel on a hospital ship to be treated here at Shorncliffe, and then died of his wounds here. That's sadly an all too common occurrence. And when Empire, Commonwealth nation soldiers like that died in military hospitals, they were buried in whatever was the local cemetery. So there's quite a few locations in Kent where we'll find these. If it was a British soldier, and this being British soil, the family, initially he would be buried here, but then the family could request after the war that the body be brought back for burial in their local churchyard. So when I lived in Elsica, for example, and I used to walk over to Wentworth, in the churchyard there was a lad in the King's Royal Rifle Corps who'd been wounded in Flanders, died of his wounds in Scotland, and then the family had his body brought back to Wentworth to be buried in the churchyard there. So it's a kind of different approach really with the deaths and the burials of British and Commonwealth servicemen here in Great Britain during the Great War. So what we're seeing amongst these Canadian burials then is a mixture of men who have died in training and those who've died of their wounds received on the battlefields of the Great War on the Western Front. So it reflects the kind of different stratas really of the Canadian experience of that war. And of course we're seeing, some of the great Canadian actions on those battlefields reflected in the deaths of soldiers in the hospital here. And I mentioned there was lots of different nationalities. Amongst the Canadian graves I can see a rising sun cap badge of an Australian soldier, so we're going to have a look at that. So on my way to look at the Australian headstone, which we'll come to in a minute, I've seen a non-standard headstone here, non-Commonwealth, non-Imperial War Graves Commission headstone. It's a very ornate grave, and I'll put a picture of it on the podcast website. And this says, "In loving memory of our dear son, Bugler William Henry Chambers, 58th Canadians, CEF, born at Toronto, Canada, November the 13th, 1898, fell mortally wounded at St. Eloi, April the 11th, 1916, died of wounds July the 5th, 1916, at Granville Hospital, Ramsgate, aged 17 years, 7 months. Dearly beloved son of Elizabeth and John W. Chambers, Toronto, Canada. He answered his country's call and nobly did his duty." So this was a lad, teenage Tommy, who'd enlisted underage, joined the Canadians, served with the 58th Battalion in Flanders, wounded in the day-to-day activities of trench warfare at Saint-Loire and the Ypres salient, and then evacuated here to Kent, and he dies of his wounds. And the family decide to put up, during the war I suspect, a very ornate headstone in his memory. So I've walked over to the Australian headstone now, and this is Private R.W. Williams of the 2nd Battalion Australian Infantry, who's died on the 6th of October 1916, aged 26. Now his battalion had been serving on the Somme front as part of the 1st Australian Division, so he's been wounded somewhere there. By his number, which is 2703, he's low enough kind of number to have served at Gallipoli the previous year. And because of my many trips to Gallipoli and what an amazing battlefield that is, I always feel a kind of strong kinship with the men who've seen during the war the sun setting over the Aegean Sea and sat by the shore alongside the graves of their mates there at Anzac or Hellas or wherever it was. And I always kind of give a nod to those Gallipoli veterans who've seen those sights. I was there in peaceful times, they were there in the midst of dark war, but nevertheless it's an incredible battlefield, Gallipoli, beautiful location but tinged with the sadness of all that happened there in 1915. So he's an Anzac veteran, served at Gallipoli and then on the Western Front, and has been wounded in the fighting between Pozieres and when they were holding the line beyond Flers perhaps, and then brought back here for treatment and died of his wounds. And there's a paper trail for all these soldiers with the Canadians and Australians that are here. Their records are not damaged in the Second World War, so you can find an awful lot of information about them. And there's probably a good book or so in the stories behind all of those who were buried in this cemetery. And just without labouring the point too much, just continuing with the Canadian casualties as I walk through this next part of the cemetery, I'm standing amongst a plot of men who died in September and October of 1916. I can see several battalions connected to the Canadian divisions on the Western Front, and I'm standing by the grave of Private Everett of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. These are all men who died of wounds received from the fighting around Courcellets, which of course will always remain a special place on that old front line to me. And I kind of think of those open fields around the village, and the Courcelette Cemetery and Regina Trench and Adanac, and the places where the CEF fought in that action of September, October and November of 1916, and these graves kind of link us to that. But Private Everett, his number is 24, so he's an original member of the PPCLI, and that original cohort of men who joined it were men, part of the criteria for enlistment was previous service in the British Regular Army. So he will have an interesting past. Every time I've researched one of those early PPCLI men, I've always found men who've served in some of the most famous actions of the British Army in that Victorian period, the Little Wars as they were often referred to, in South Africa and places like India, and probably he had a few campaign medals from those conflicts under the old Queen, as they referred to Victoria as, on his chest when he enlisted. So probably a very interesting story there. And he would have gone out with the early draft of the PPCLI, the battalion that went out in the winter of 1914, the 1st Canadian Infantry Battalion, to go to the Western Front. And he's gone through some of those key battles. On the 8th of May 1915 at Bellewaerde, they fought almost the last stand there. And then in the battles of June 1916 in Sanctuary Wood and Hill 62, they were very heavily involved. So this is a man who's certainly seen some combat on the Western Front. Like I say, so many stories here. Now again, on my way to the next plot of this cemetery, there's an area where there are men who've served in the armed forces. So there was obviously a qualification to be allowed to be buried within this Shorncliffe military cemetery. And one immediately stood out because there is one of the post-World War I grave markers, plaques, that were placed on the graves of old contemptibles. And they were placed there by the Old Contemptibles Association. And this one reads, in loving of my dear husband, Bombardier G. Tothill, Raw Horse Artillery, who died 30th of March 1938, aged 53 years, until we meet. And in front of it is the Old Contemptibles plaque to G. Tothill, Raw Horse Artillery, Folkestone branch of the Old Contemptibles Association. So to be a member of that, he will have the 1914 star, the so-called Mons star, that was awarded for men who served in France and Flanders from the 5th of August to the 22nd of November 1914. And the Old Contemptibles Association was a very active organisation after the war to remember the sacrifice of those men of what was often called the Red Little Dead Little Army, the regular army that had marched off to war in 1914. And Andrew Thornton, who's done a lot of research on the Old Contemptibles, has highlighted the plight of these Old Contemptibles Association plaques sadly being stolen from cemeteries and put onto auction sites. Andrew was a guest on the podcast, I think in our very first year, highlighting some of the research that he's done, and he's done a huge amount of really valuable research on the history of the Old Contemptibles Association, and well worth checking him out on Twitter. But not far away from this grave is another one that says, Affectionate Remembrance of Private J. Dugan, VC, of 1st KDG, who died in 1940. So that's the 1st King's Dragoon Guards. And he got his Victoria Cross in the First Boer War in 1881. And he died many years after his military service. I think he's one of several recipients of the Victoria Cross to be buried in this kind of larger Shorncliffe cemetery. But what then caught my eye was it's an open book, his grave, with him on one side, on the other side, in memory of his wife, Mary Dugan, who died in 1926, and underneath it says, also their 2 sons, Jack and Dick, killed in the Great War. So a man who'd gone through, those kind of Victorian army, a steadfast and forthright Victorian soldier, awarded the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest award for his gallantry, watched his 2 sons march off the war, and 2 of them get killed. And one wonders kind of what went through the minds of men under those kind of circumstances. So it just shows what you can find in places like this. I mentioned how that the casualties that are buried here at Shorncliffe Military Cemetery are not men who died in combat as such. They're men who died of their wounds or in training. But there is a plot of graves in here that date from the 25th of May 1917. It's a very noticeable plot of graves where that date is repeated again and again. And what they are victims of the first ever Gotha Bomber raid on Britain during the Great War. On that day, the 25th of May 1917, the Germans sent a force of Gotha bombers across the Channel to bomb London. And there was cloud over the target, so they couldn't bomb the capital city. Instead, they came down to Kent and they bombed here. And a lot of bombs fell on the wider kind of Folkestone, Shorncliffe area. And it's recorded in the war diaries of the Canadian units that were here. And there's a very good account in one of them that I'm going to read for you now. A German air raid took place over Folkestone and vicinity at about 6:15 p.m. There were 18 aeroplanes of the most modern type, carrying very highly explosive bombs, some weighing 80 pounds. They began at Limp, where there is an aerodrome, and there dropped 19 bombs. At Hythe, 19, at Sandgate, 2, at Cheriton, 16, and St Martin's Plain, 8, and 40 at Folkestone. One bomb just missed the Westcliff Hospital and struck the garage in the backyard. The Cadillac motor car on charge to the ADMS was wrecked. The ADMS himself was about 30 yards away. At the time, the streets were thronged with civilians and soldiers. One street visited was almost a shambles, with pools of blood, dead horses and civilians, mostly women and children. Many houses were wrecked. On St Martin's Plain, 4 soldiers were pitching a tent. A bomb made a direct hit, and the remains of the men were gathered up in bags. 2 huts were demolished as well as the inmates. One bomb nearly wrecked the Shorncliffe Military Hospital, but which failed to explode. one of the lady stenographers of the ADMS office was killed on the street. Herewith is the detailed account of the casualties, civil and military. The planes were flying at an altitude of about 15,000 feet and got away without being engaged until they reached the French coast, where 3 are reported to have been shot down. And the casualties reported in that war diary are civilians killed 68, wounded 56, a total of 124, military casualties 108, and with the civilians the grand total is 232. So this was a kind of turning point in the war. Zeppelins had bombed Britain from the very beginning of the conflict. I think from memory one bombed Dover quite early on in the war. So bombing from the air wasn't a new prospect for civilians in Great Britain, the kind of first blitz, if we can kind of call it that. But this was a change in warfare, not airships, Zeppelins that were getting easier to shoot down. These were high-altitude bombers that could come over and drop pretty hefty payloads, and they continued to do that in Britain and indeed on the Western Front. We've mentioned at Tarpler, for example, in a recent video blog, a vlog, where we spoke about how the base was bombed there and members of the YMCA were killed amongst many others besides, including many of the patients in some of the hospitals there. So this was an ever-increasing threat, and although that war diary claims that some were shot down subsequently over the French coast, actually, from some of the research that I looked at, it seems that the planes just couldn't reach them for the altitude that they kind of ascended to. So it was a great threat, really, the arrival of and use of Gotha bombers in those final 2 years of the Great War. So what we've got really with this cemetery is kind of a mix of different aspects of the Great War. People who've died in enlistment and training and service at home, men who've fallen ill and died of sickness, others killed in accidents. And then from the military hospitals that were here, we've got those who died of their wounds received on the battlefront. We've got men who were killed in an aerial bombardment by the Germans in 1917. And then when we look at the kind of breadth of different nationalities in here, we've got Britain and the Empire and men from China as well. So it just shows again what kind of stories, what kind of Great War history that we can find on our doorstep that connects us to the Great War, connects us to those stories and pathways of the Great War, and links us forever, as always, to the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline.